Good morning. My name is Katarina Tracz, and I am the director of Stockholm Free World Forum, or Frivärd, as our name is in Swedish. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, the Atlantic Council and Anna Wislander and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for inviting me here today to moderate this first panel focusing on Baltic Sea security. We have already heard excellent keynote speeches covering the broader context of Northern European security, and not just European one. We also saw the expose relating the region to a wider, more global context. But now it's time to dig into the specifics of the Baltic Sea region. In 2017, the Baltic Sea security is in transition. NATO is implementing its decision from the Warsaw Summit to place multinational battle groups in the Baltic states and in Poland. The US is strengthening its military presence in the region, in the east and in the north. As lead nations in the enhanced forward presence of NATO, the US, Germany, Canada, and the UK become more tightly knit to the region, both militarily as well as politically. Yet, the new presidential administration in the US has raised concern over the US long term engagement to Europe. And here, the Nordic Baltic region is no exception. In 2017, we asked ourselves, is the US still key to the defense of the Baltics? What responsibilities can and do regional actors take? What are the implications for defense and deterrence and for dialogue with Russia? And how could and should Sweden and Finland relate to NATO's new force structure? With us today to discuss these issues, we have a highly knowledgeable and highly distinguished panel. Edward Lucas, you have already heard, he had to run away, unfortunately. But let me introduce our other panelists. We have Michał Barankowski, who is director of the German Marshall Fund, Warsaw in office. Welcome. We have Dr. Barbara Kuntz, who is a research fellow at the Institut Français de Relations Internationales. Welcome. And from Sweden, we have Dr. Mike Winnerstig, who is Deputy Research Director for the Swedish Defense and Research Agency, FOI. Welcome. I will let all of you share your thoughts on the topic with us, with introductions. After this, I'm hoping to have an open discussion between us. And after that, I will open up for the audience that is also consists of highly distinguished and highly knowledgeable people here today. So I hope that all of you will like to join the discussion towards the end. But first of all, I will give the floor to Michał, please.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you all here. Thank you to Anna, thank you to Atlantic Council and CAS for the invitation. Even though the weather could be a little bit more Christmassy, it's still much better than in Warsaw, where we haven't seen snow just yet. And I'm here to share with you the perspective from Warsaw. I will embrace the term frontline state that Ed Lucas thought maybe is not politically correct, but it's certainly that's the level and that's intensity of thinking that we have in Warsaw. I would like to start maybe with good news. What is happening in the positive terms when it comes to security in the Baltic states? Then look at challenges. Look at what the alliance has to do and what are national efforts and where we have gaps, because I actually think that the gaps are still very much there. So on the good news part, as you all know, Warsaw Summit introduced enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and Poland. We now have 4 battalion groups. On top of this, there is a rotating brigade, armored brigade combat team throughout the eastern flank states. This strategy I would describe as a good tripwire plus strategy. Tripwire because these forces are there to really be the tripwires for anything bad that Russians might send our way and really provide the deterrence so they don't. The plus comes from the fact that they are not only there to stand up and die, but actually to fight. But this strategy is based on the assumption that these tripwires are connected to something, to greater follow-on forces and ability to reinforce our frontline allies. And this is, this is, I think, the key. I'll be the person who focuses on the conventional side of things because we should certainly talk about the unconventional aspect of it. But that's key for the ability to reinforce. It's absolutely key to provide a real deterrence. If you are not able to do it, then as a decision maker at a NATO level or maybe in Washington, in case of something bad happening in the Baltic states, some kind of bad hybrid scenario, you are faced with 2 very bad options. One is to do very little. Secondly, you really look very close, very quickly at nuclear escalation, which is not politically feasible. It's politically very, very costly. So that's why the conventional forces in the midst of the strategy are so key. What we are facing on the Russian side is, you will all know that, so I'll just run through this very quickly. But on one hand, we have A2AD capabilities from Kaliningrad that are making the reinforcement much harder. Zapad exercise that has shown great ability to both move and organize forces. This is a country that has robust military modernization program and is mastering the ability to use it and frankly to use besides the hard military stuff with the hybrid operations, really a full spectrum of options, just as Minister of Defense and Prime Minister Carl Bildt spoke. They are showing ability to use military strength. So what should we do? And this is, maybe first I will focus on the efforts of the frontline states. So given that our analysis is that what we have done between Wales and Warsaw is good, and it's certainly a great improvement, but unfortunately it's not yet sufficient for full deterrence. Well, one is we will have to address these issues. I mean, right now we are in a place where we either feel vulnerable, and that's not acceptable. We either go into very robust domestic military spending, and Poland is one example. Recently, Polish Parliament has passed a law raising spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Or third option, and really the second and third option is something that we do at the same time, turn to Americans for bilateral support. And that's, I would argue, not particularly great for the alliance, that countries that are vulnerable either turn to Americans or sort of desperately try to spend their way out of it. Because, this is not an easy process to actually modernize your forces to be able to stand chance with much greater adversary, let alone something we don't have answer to, of course, it's their nuclear capabilities. So I think this all underlines the need for us to focus in the next summit on really make sure that the follow-on forces are there. We have contingency planning, we have the graduated response plans. When I talk with my colleagues in Brussels, they tell me, they're unfortunately largely empty. We don't have forces that are ready enough to come and help you. If we take, for example, 180 days period. I mean, and 180 days is certainly way too long for us. The key to this on the European side is Germany. And it's not just German spending, which certainly will be very welcome, but it's German readiness. Right now, again, the readiness that we see and that NATO sees in the Bundeswehr is very low in a way that we can't really count on the sufficient response in the follow-on forces in case of a crisis. So again, the credibility of deterrence in this is undermined. Secondly, of course, it's mobility and military Schengen. So once we have the forces, we have to make sure that we can move them quickly. We have to practice through exercises, make sure that logistics are working. And it's really switching the alliance to more of a war-fighting mentality. Not to fight any wars, but to make sure that we are ready so that deterrence works a little bit more. We had recently a workshop where we looked at concrete proposals, given that Germany is not going to spend overnight 2%, or nor many other countries. Poland is spending over 2% right now, not also because of Donald Trump, and we can talk a little bit more about relationship with America. We are spending this because of President Putin. But one concrete proposal would be to actually identify a brigade in each of the bigger member states that with very high readiness, so we can again fill those graduated response plans. So this is all on the conventional side, and I will just briefly mention the other side. I mean, of course, we cannot forget about the informational warfare, cyber warfare, hybrid scenarios. One would argue, and many argue, that from Russian perspective, we are already in a cyber war, informational war-like situation. And if we look at what happened in the United States, Russia was successful in striking at the heart of democracy. They were fortunately less successful in Germany. They tried it in France, but this is certainly not the end of their efforts. We are seeing it in Poland and in other Central European states as well. No one will turn Poles into pro-Russians, so they are using different methods of polarizing the society. But I guess the overall point of this is that we have made great progress between Wales and Warsaw, but the job is far from being done, and we are facing a potential adversary that is weak demographically, increasingly weak economically, but throughout this time is raising its military spending and is building up its forces. So there is I would say the most dangerous moment is where those two trends, the downward trend of economic and demographic power, cuts the military robust modernization trend. As you know, that regime does not have a way of leaving the power in a happy place. So I guess this is a call for us in the specific points that both the alliance and countries in the region in cooperation with the United States, should do more. Otherwise, we'll be in potential trouble. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michał, for those very concrete remarks and some clear suggestions also. I will save my follow-up questions to the end of all your keynotes, so I will pass on the word to Barbara, please.
Thank you very much. And of course, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, especially since I come from a city that probably doesn't really predestine you to be invited to talking about northern security. Well, what I would like to use my 5 to 7 minutes for is to look at the ongoing debate about European defense and to see what's in it for Baltic Sea region security, and also in connection to that Nordic security. And the ongoing debate, at least a little bit further south from here, is mainly about what's going on in the EU these days. And well, you probably all read or heard the quote by Federica Mogherini, who said that there has been more progress in European defense in the past 10 months than in the past 10 years, which is very much true. Well, it also depends, of course, from where you started. But there certainly is a sense of euphoria these days, defense euphoria in Europe, meaning the EU, in this context. And there's two reasons to that. Brexit is one of that, and this feeling that the main obstacle is gone. We will see whether that really is a correct assumption, but never mind, that's a strong point in the discourse. But also this idea that the French-German motor is back on track, at least was until the German elections. And we will have to see what comes out of German government formation. And perhaps most importantly, France back on the scene with a true willingness to actually shape both the debate and actual European defense policies. Now, the outcomes, despite of what we've all read in the press, are actually not that revolutionary. I mean, we're still very far away from any European army, and nobody has the attention to create a European army. It's not a military union. It's also not an alliance or anything like that. But there have indeed been some things happening, and the most debated and the most present in the media is probably PESCO, which was officially launched just yesterday with a list of 17 projects. There is also the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense card, which is currently in its, testing phase and is supposed to be implemented for real, so to say, starting 2019. And then there's the European Defense Fund. I mean, those three are the main measures in EU context. But I think it's also important not to forget there's a number of ideas floating around that are outside multilateral frameworks, which is nothing new, of course, that has been existing for a long time. But one of them that is currently probably the most debated one is the European Intervention Initiative that was proposed by President Macron a couple of weeks ago. Also, I dare say, is a reaction to a very inclusive PESCO that did not necessarily meet the real expectations of Paris, to put it that way. So looking at all these developments, what are the implications for Baltic Sea region security? And there are, of course, direct, but perhaps even more importantly, indirect consequences. As far as direct implications are concerned, they're not that many, and that obviously lies in the very nature of the common security and defense policy, which is simply not meant to be about collective defense, but there's still some. And I mean, very broadly, you can of course argue that anything that strengthens European capabilities is good for European security. That also goes for the defense industry and developments that might take place within the context of the EDF. But I guess that, seen from that perspective, the most important step that, if it's really implemented, will enhance Baltic Sea region security is what Michał already mentioned, is the military Schengen project. If you look at the 17 projects that were adopted yesterday, you will see that this is by far the project with the most participants. You have the Netherlands as the lead nations, and you have 22 participants, and you have France as an observer, meaning that everybody's in there except one country of those participating in PESCO. And it is also a very clear and often expressed US interest. And we will see how that goes further, because obviously this is a huge project that will not be tackled in a couple of months. We are waiting for an action plan that is supposed to be published in spring 2018, and then we will see how it goes from there and how much money there will be in there. Now, when it comes to indirect implications, I think what is clearly visible these days, and the debate we're following, is that while we've overcome this old debate of NATO versus EU defense, we are increasingly having maybe not a new divide, but a tendency to sort of pitch territorial defense against crisis management, which is not entirely new, but it still is a new, so say, essence in this old debate, because obviously the different priorities also are very much symmetrical to the old priorities when it comes to US role. And this, of course, implies different points of focus, different attention, but it can potentially also boil down to different military policies, capabilities, and so on. And this is notably the case after Brexit, when the friends of NATO, to put it that way, lose their most important proponent. Now, the good news is that we're clearly seeing some progress in EU-NATO cooperation. There was a declaration in 2016, but just very recently, 30 new actions were decided upon. There is the ambition to have a more systematic cooperation in 2018, sorry. So we are in a good way. But of course, what is the key issue in this context is the compatibility of what's going on in the EU with what's going on in NATO. And this refers to, on the one hand, CARD and the Capability Development Plan, as well as NATO and DPP, and especially in light of limited resources in a single set of forces, which is perhaps a dimension that is not at the core of the thinking of the larger member states. Also, a second key point in the current context is, of course, the question to know what's going to happen with third states in an EU context, and there the decision will also be taken in 2018. Now, the major attention in this context is, of course, on the UK, but Norway in the northern context is, of course, also a key issue. So to briefly conclude, well, now we have PESCO, and this is sort of sold as a major step forward in European defense. I guess it's important not to forget that now is still the time for agenda setting, because although PESCO 17 projects have now been decided upon, and the talk of the town, so to say, is very much looking south rather than north or east. It is still, despite all this euphoria, not clear where EU defense cooperation is going, meaning that there is room for there is room for agenda setting, which of course also applies in a much wider transatlantic context, where we also don't really know where we're going. And in this context, and this will be my final sentence, whether a combined approach in relation to this conference's topic, that is North Atlantic, Arctic, and the Baltic Sea region, I think in this EU context is something that needs to be thought of very carefully, because there are various pros and cons that we can discuss later. But overall, I think the most important point is that there still is need for agenda setting in the present context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for sort of bringing the EU context to the region. I completely agree with you that we tend to overlook this perspective when discussing the regional security dynamics. And with that, I will give the word to the final final speaker before we open up for discussion between us. Mike, please.
Thank you very much, Katarina, and thanks for inviting me. I have to start with the usual disclaimer, of course, that my views here today are not representing any views of my agency nor of the Swedish government. I'm only speaking for myself right now. And I want to go back to what Michal started out with the EFP, the Enhanced Forward Presence in the Baltic states and in Poland in particular. As in my mind, this is a fairly well-balanced concept after all. We know that the Russians are paranoid. If we would place, or if NATO would place or base a brigade of armored troops each in the Baltic states that have been suggested by some of the war gamers that have run war games on the situation or in the area, so to speak. This would be a fairly substantial force, and it could be used as something pretty bad or a pretext for something bad on behalf of the Russians. So having this kind of minor modest force in this region and in these countries is fairly good, at least as of now. But it is a tripwire force, as Michal said, and the deterrence effect of this force is completely linked to our ability to make real forces out of it in a later stage. And although I kind of disagree a little bit here with Katarina that we need to take in the EU in the current security context, we really don't in many ways. But in one way, it is extremely important, and that goes back to Barbara's comments on the military Schengen thing, because the transportation and the logistics of major forces through the Baltic states and Poland from other Western European countries is not a trivial thing. It is a major operation and is now completely bogged down in civilian kind of logistical and border-related problems, bureaucratic problems in particular. But there are, of course, other issues that need to be taken into account if we are going to have a credible, and with we, I mean the West as a whole, NATO and its partners, if we are going to have a credible deterrence posture in the Baltic Sea. Two things that come to mind, in particular from a military perspective anyway, are first the A2AD problem, the ability of Russia to counter all forms of movements of troops and military reinforcements in the Baltic Sea through long-range missiles and other forms of weaponry. How to overcome that, how to kinetically and in other ways deal with it is one of the major problems for any credible force posture here. The other thing is, unfortunately, that we have to consider the linkage between conventional force posture and nuclear strategy. We haven't been forced to talk about nuclear issues for a very long time here in this region, but we are now seeing increasingly that the Russians are talking about nuclear issues, and that leads us to be able to understand what's going on and to see this in a nuclear perspective, so to speak. This sounds, unfortunately, pretty much like the discussions during the Cold War. Many of you recall those, and in fact, this is due to the issue of Russian nuclear saber-rattling, if you wish. And even if this current situation is very dissimilar to the Cold War in many ways, this particular aspect is still there, and we need to deal with it. Not because we like to, but because it's important to understand the linkages and the coupling of conventional and nuclear forces in Russian military thinking. And we cannot let our kind of well-meaning taboo here in Sweden, perhaps in particular, on nuclear issues stop us from considering the strategic ramifications of this. So, on the role of Sweden and Finland then in this context. I mean, obviously, both countries have made major changes in their strategic outlook for the last 5-10 years or so. Sweden perhaps more than Finland, both in terms of military posture and in terms of strategic thinking. But still, the major issues are there for both countries on the conceptual level, perhaps, and the strategic level more than on the military level, because we're both moving from a very clear isolationist stance where the key thing for both our countries was to avoid becoming entangled in wars, other countries' wars in particular, to a stance where we are actively seeking participation to prevent wars, but also to take part in them if there should be a war in our vicinity, because of the fact that we both believe that any war here in the Baltic Sea region would automatically draw us into it because of our geopolitical locations, respectively. But this has profound consequences for both Finnish and Swedish armed forces and the use of Swedish and Finnish armed forces as well. We are finding ourselves in a situation where we are forced to reconsider most of what we've been thinking the last 25 years or so in terms of how we are going to use our armed forces. One good starting point in my mind at least would be to join exercise-wise the EFP forces in the Baltic states and Poland, to let Finnish and Swedish troops join in exercises in these states with regular troops, just to get a feeling of that kind of integrated concept, to have the ability to be more interoperable than what is currently the case. And there are good reasons for that. We had Estonian troops here at the Aurora exercise in September. For example, they were National Guard-style troops, but we could easily see a future where we have regular units from both countries working in Estonia and Sweden, and also in the other Baltic states and Poland. This is something that has been done to a part already, but I think it could be developed much more. And it's a good way as well of peacetime exercises and peacetime signaling as well, that this is actually something we could consider also in a worst case scenario. But all this means as well, and given the backdrop here, of course, of the defense minister's statement today that Sweden is a country which believes that security is built together with others, that was kind of his phrase, which he's repeating a lot, and this is something that we also hear from Finland, at least occasionally. This means, obviously, that if you want to do this in an effective way, we have to consider more ways of doing defense planning, more and better ways of collaborating together with the countries in our own neighborhood, and having essentially a process where our former policy of military isolationism through non-alignment and formally neutrality gives way to a policy of military integration instead. This is kind of the key thing for our future work here, in my mind anyway. And then this, of course, means that the end goal of our position here, and this goes both for Finland and Sweden, in my mind at least, would be to essentially work together with one certain end goal, namely to apply simultaneously at the same time for NATO membership at a future point. Because this would mean that we could solve all the problems that we currently are dealing with here. We could easily integrate ourselves into the defense planning of NATO at the time. We would increase tremendously the deterrence aspects of the Baltic Sea region. We would also, of course, make the region much more stable in the sense that it would be no room anymore for the ambiguity that is currently affecting both Swedish and Finnish defense policy. The ambiguity was formerly considered as part of our freedom of action, our freedom of maneuver, so to speak. But now it's more of a drawback than anything else from a strategic perspective, as it deals with the fact that nobody really knows what Sweden and Finland are going to do. If they are attacked, if Finland is attacked, will Sweden help them? If the Baltic states are attacked and Sweden, due to our solidarity declaration of 2009, will we help the Baltic states, and will in that case Finland help us? This is by no means certain. And this unfortunately leads to ambiguity and a lot of kind of clouds surrounding our positions respectively. So in my mind, having this as the end goal for both states at the same time would lead to a much more stable situation in the Baltic Sea region, And it would also clarify for all actors, especially Russia, of course, that the stakes are pretty high in terms of changing that situation. And that would be to the benefit of all of us, including, I would argue, Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for those remarks. I have a couple of follow-up questions, and also I encourage you in the panel to sort of feel free to comment on what you have heard from the other panelists, so you can sort of divert from my questions as well, and also wave a little bit when you want to speak. I will start following up on what you, Michał, mentioned, and this relates to Mike's remarks as well, namely on the issue of bilateral defense cooperation. Michał, you mentioned that in a certain way, turning directly to the US could be problematic. And I'm curious to sort of hear you evolve your thoughts on this a bit more. And it also relates to what Mike mentioned on the cooperation, the bilateral defense cooperation between Sweden and Finland, which is not entirely unproblematic, I take it, from your point of view. And I would also like to hear you, Mike, develop a bit further your stance on the Swedish defense cooperation with the US and also on the Finnish one. So please.
Sure, thanks. Well, the problematic aspect of bilateralism is the alliance is meant to be an alliance of all member states together. If we start picking and choosing and developing relationships basically outside of the alliance, it lowers the solidarity and readiness of the alliance as a whole. It's not problematic from well, it's not problematic directly from Poland's perspective if we get the stuff that we need from the Americans, which by the way is on one hand happening. There is a likelihood that the bilateral cooperation will further increase. It's also happening in a with a very different narrative in Poland vis-a-vis United States and Trump than in many Western European countries, which I think is not particularly good for us as an alliance as a whole and EU as a whole. But it's also not, it's not particularly politically sustainable on the American side either. Because if the answer to the question, what should we do about European security, is always more Americans, it's just not going to work very well over time. I mean, we are seeing this much more in the words that President Trump has said in both in campaign and after coming to office, not really in the deeds, right? The reality in the ground is a different one. European Defense Initiative, Deterrence Initiative has just gotten even more money. So Secretary Mattis is running Pentagon as if it was not Trump's Pentagon. And in fact, the new national security strategy very much looks like it's not particularly Trumpian national security strategy. But he is in the end President of the United States, and these are feelings that a lot of people in the population has in the United States, and in the end, we go into the direction of bilateralism. It lowers motivation for European member states to step in and step up on the defense, both not only the eastern flank, the southern flank, and the end of the alliance as a whole. So that's my worry that this will go this way. Thanks.
Thank you. Mike, do you agree with that?
Well, sort of. I have to say, though, I'm by training a U.S. researcher. I've been focusing on U.S. foreign policy for a very long time. And this administration is extremely interesting in that perspective, because if you look at what Mr. Trump said in his election campaign, what he's tweeting at 3 o'clock in the morning and so on, you get a certain idea of what he wants. And then his, as Michael says, his Pentagon, his Defense Department does something completely different. We've seen now a great increase in both the money and the troops available for the defense of Europe on behalf of the United States. This is going on, and the budget proposal now from both the administrations and the side of Congress is just underlining this, which is very interesting in many ways. However, though, I believe if we start with Trump as a person, that his way of making business has affected his security policy very much. He wants to scare people into doing what he wants, which is, in his mind, to raise their defense spending. Thus, he kind of withdraws his, at least verbal support for Article 5 in NATO in order to force the Europeans to spend more on defense. This is my personal interpretation of his tactics, so to speak. And now some people, several countries in Europe, much more than before anyway, are actually doing that. They're spending much more on defense. Poland is a key case in point here with 2.5% in a few years' time. This is a good result, you could argue, if you're Mr. Trump anyway, of that particular tactic. But other than that, of course, his basic views are highly problematic. We know this. They've been on since the 1980s, but obviously he has outsourced the real policy, the deeds of the United States, to Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, and also the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, who's been writing now a new national security strategy that is going to be published next week, I think, which will be, as far as I can tell, pretty un-Trumpian or non-Trumpian, so to speak. And that's also very interesting. On bilateral things, I mean, there is always a risk here when you have multilateral institutions and you're supposed to make policy in an institutional multilateral framework, and then people start to make deals on the side, bilaterally or trilaterally. This is not good for the institution, and this goes for the EU as much as for NATO, actually. When you have deals that kind of short-circuit the entire multilateral operation, this could be a problem. I agree with Michael on that. On the other hand, you have to start somewhere, and the Finnish-Swedish cooperation, as I mentioned, is problematic in the sense that nobody really knows where it's going or where its limits are. But still, it's a good start for something that is brand new to both Sweden and Finland, brand new, at least in the context of the last 100 to 200 years or so. So in that sense, it's good. But finally, or eventually rather, you need to make up your mind about what this is going to lead to. If you have an alliance, a bilateral alliance between Sweden and Finland, this is not really deterring anyone. You have to have a close, if you want to deter a country like Russia, you need to have close Finnish-Swedish cooperation within the NATO framework rather than outside the NATO framework. This is my view on this.
Thank you, Mike. I want to follow up on something that you said, Barbara, namely that now is the time for agenda setting within the developments of the CSDP. If we sort of get a bit more specific here and we focus on the Baltic Sea region, which is the topic of this panel, how do you think that we could contribute in this agenda setting to sort of bring the CSDP to this region?
Maybe as a first remark, just to clarify one thing. I mean, I definitely do not think that CSDP should solve the security situation in the Baltic Sea region. That's not the point I wanted to make. What I wanted to say is that we are currently seeing developments in the CSDP field that will or might result in expectations towards EU member states to do things that are perhaps not compatible with their primary defense interests. That is my point, because those primary defense interests are, well, to simplify it, things that are dealt with in NATO. That was my sort of the key point that I wanted to make. And whether the EU at all has a role to play here in this context in the military field. I mean, the treaties are very clear about that. So in that sense, it's more of a non-issue. Still, the EU, I mean, at the political level, of course, played and plays a very important role through sanctions and all these things that shouldn't be underestimated either. So in that sense, agenda setting, I think the key point is really to work towards avoiding this incompatibility between what's going on in the CSDP and developments in NATO going in another direction. And there, I think, is first of all, I mean, very very simply, is to raise awareness for that. I mean, I come from a town where the debate is very, I wouldn't say heated, but where really the CSDP thing and PESCO and strategic autonomy for the European Union is the talk of the town. And the problem with strategic autonomy for the European Union is that also I think that except Paris, nobody really has a clear idea what that would actually imply. But this is exactly one of these points where I think that some agenda setting just in debating those issues and bringing in various perspectives is really key.
Thank you. Before we open up the floor to questions from the audience and comments, I would like to touch a bit upon what Edward mentioned before he had to leave for the airport, namely, well, we have been discussing mostly conventional military issues here. I, by the way, find the word conventional a bit problematic in this context because the awareness today is, in my perception at least, is so broad that there are unconventional and what was formerly known as unconventional components that are all playing into this. But if we're still to sort of touch upon the unconventional aspects, namely what is sometimes referred to as hybrid warfare, information warfare, full spectrum warfare, whatever you want to call it, how do you, and this is a question to all of you in the panel, how do you suggest that the region addresses this and works more closely to counter these issues that are very much on the top of the agenda right now and are very much constituting a part of the general threat awareness? Want to start, please?
Happy to. I think that the full spectrum, we should be talking about full spectrum from info, cyber, hybrid, through conventional, all the way to nuclear. Because this is frankly exactly how our adversaries are looking at it. Still, and we are still dividing it much. You know, just as Mike said, we are also hardly touching the nuclear component, which the Russians explicitly said if they choose to, in order to de-escalate the conflict, like a small tactical strike in order to send a clear message. So, I mean, so the sort of the easy thing to say, yes, we have to get better on all this. Yes, we are making progress with the centers of excellence, but there is a very wide disparity among member states in ability not only to defend, but even to basically. Totally. Not only to defend, but actually to just identify that they are being attacked through informational means, especially. So identification is clearly one, and here I don't think we should lock ourselves in the region. I think that's, this is clearly an issue that can touch any of the member states, even though the particular signs will be a little bit different. The strategy is very clear. It's to divide us internally, using different issues. In Poland, it's Polish versus Ukrainians. In in Estonia, it might be the Russian minority. On cyber, I think we have to get much better in defining cyber deterrence. Yes, it's a new domain. Great that NATO identified it as a new domain, but we are still walking, around it like it's something totally different. And a couple things that I think are not that are relatively easy to that we could do that draw from deterrence in conventional and nuclear domains is we actually have to show a little bit of our of an alliance, and not every ally has it, but of offensive capabilities. This is particularly true for some of the bigger member states. Actually, you have to show the other side what you have. You have to be a little bit clearer about the red lines. We know that cyber attacks can have very much a real life effects, just as if it was a conventional strike. So we have to be a little bit clearer about that. And maybe a third point is that we probably have to do away with the separation. That if something happens in cyber, the response can be only in cyber. Our adversary is not doing it this way. We should not be holding ourselves to the same limitations. The challenge will be in coordination, because there is such a huge disparity among the member states, both in the defense and offensive capabilities on the cyber side. But it will be a beginning.
Thank you. Mike, I saw you taking some notes.
Yeah, I think that this is a very important subject as well. And if we consider non-conventional means as the means that are not conventional military or nuclear military, I think that we could do much more through a much more integrated EU-NATO kind of cooperation here. I mean, these are areas where both organizations have their strengths. Not least the EU, which actually has an anti-disinformation center already within the confines of the External Action Service. This is very good and should be developed, in my mind. And we need as well to understand that much of the current Russian propaganda that is directed to most of our countries is played along the old KGB textbooks of the 1980s, I would say. They target the same audiences. They present the same kind of arguments at times anyway, but they have also added a set of other arguments that are now related to right-wing causes here in Europe, traditional values, anti-immigration campaigns, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more postmodern attitude, if you wish, from the Russian side right now, which means that we have to counter it as well in these ways, at a multi-dimensional, so to speak, within a multi-dimensional approach. And that is very difficult, actually, as we live in a free society where everyone can find their ways of understanding things. But I think it's mandatory for us, as Lucas said, to not get Putinized doing this. We have to keep our free society up and running. That's the key strength of our society, after all.
Thank you, Barbara. Would you like to add something to that?
There is not too much to add. Maybe one thing in addition, and that is educating citizens. Simply, I think that one of the reasons why we haven't seen a repetition of what happened in the U.S. and both campaigns in France and Germany, for instance, this year, is also because people have become less naive. Not everybody, of course, and some just want to believe what comes from Moscow, but that, for instance, the leak of some Macron internal documents just 2 days before the election sort of fell flat. I also attribute that to the fact that people have seen this happen now and are willing to take a step back and think. And I think this is also a way to go. I mean, just not necessarily a role for the state here, but for foundations and journalist organizations and so on.
Thank you. With that, I would like to open up the floor for questions. I know that there's a lot of knowledge in this room that I would like to bring into the discussion. I know many of you, but not all of you. So, in the name of fairness, please introduce yourselves when you're handed the microphone. And I had a first question over here from.
Thank you. My name is Carolina Wendel-Palin. I'm with the Swedish Defence Research Agency, just as Mike. Thank you for 3 brilliant interventions. I would like to bring us back to conventional warfare. And my question is directed perhaps primarily to Michal. You talked about readiness of brigades. When we look at Russian military development and the way they think about this, they define a unit as battle ready when it has 70% manpower and weapons and equipment in place. And so my question would be, what would be the time scale for us on the Western side to see a significant improvement when it comes to raising the readiness level in the units in the West? And also connected with this, when we look at Russian military operations, what we look at is whether they have all the different components, the military capabilities that are needed. Do they have maneuver units? Do they have artillery units? And you talked about logistics and mobility. You need all of these units, all of these capabilities. And so when you look at the West and the ability to put together a large-scale military operation, are there any military capabilities in specific that you see that we need to address? And also connected to this, when Russia conducts its large-scale military operations, they always exercise the civilian components as well. Do you have any comments on how we, develop an all-of-society approach in the West? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One question that was partially 3 questions, so I'll let you answer all of them.
Okay,
thanks. They're directed to you.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent question and emphasizing what we are dealing with on the other side. What timeline of readiness is basically as soon as possible is the best answer. Of course, that's a difficult part, but I think the way to approach this is we have large forces throughout different European member states, and it would be, we can either spread the effort and raise them over time to good level of readiness. And I had just conversations about this last week in Berlin when I was hearing from the German MOD about a long timeline. I think that's not the best idea, because the time lag is when we are increasingly vulnerable. So I think the way to do it is to focus on smaller units. That would be brigade size for big country, and raise the readiness of that unit much higher. In some member states, it's not a big problem at all. I mean, France has capabilities that are deployable quickly. In other places, it will take longer. But I think that's actually a pretty good goal for the summit, or for the leaders, that slightly sidesteps the question of 2% as well, because we will not solve this issue overnight. But when we can actually show readiness, that's in concrete terms, I think that helps us also in the burden sharing debate. Your second question was about capabilities that I see as needed. I mean, and I'm sure there are other people who can answer it much better. But I would put strategic transport enablers, and also capabilities like AWACS that give us situational awareness very high on the agenda. What we are seeing also in our part of the in our region is increasing electronic warfare capabilities. So that's another thing that we should make sure that is part of our mix. So thanks.
Thank you. We have a question here in the front from Anna.
Thank you, and thank you for 3 excellent interventions. I would like perhaps each one of you to comment on the role of Germany more specifically from your various perspectives. I'm thinking of Germany as perhaps re-emerging as a Baltic Sea power or Baltic Sea nation, question mark. Do you agree on that or not? And from the developments now in the EU with the defense cooperation, it's easy that we, as you are in Paris, get hooked a bit on the French perspective because they're so vocal about this. But actually it's driven both by France and Germany. What are the German interests in this? And could Germany be some kind of guarantor for a Northern European perspective and way of dealing with the development of EU defense cooperation ahead?
Thank you, and I think we'll answer that question in the opposite direction now, starting with Barbara.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. Maybe start with the French-German tandem and EU defense policy. I mean, to be very blunt and very short, I think the big difference between France and Germany in this is that for France, this is security and defense policy. For Germany, it's European integration. And that basically gives you the different outlooks on these issues. And I mean, this is also in a nutshell debate between Paris and Berlin on PESCO, how many countries, and how this should be done. If I may just abuse my position here, is if anybody's interested, we are releasing a big report on French-German defense cooperation possibilities tomorrow in Paris at our institute. You're all very welcome. But I mean, this report, I can disclose already, and I mean, it's been a year-long working process with a group of experts from both countries, is that the tandem still has a very hard time to find common ground because the outlooks are very different and the interests are very different and also the instincts are very different. And especially on the German side, I mean, if you read it through the lens of European integration, it all makes a lot of sense. But if you look at defense policies, you will see that it's very, very NATO-oriented and still also, I mean, like in many parts of Europe, based on this idea that things will get better once Trump is gone. And so in that sense, I still find that, I mean, French-German defense cooperation is extremely complicated and in dire need of symbolic steps forward, but I rather think that to pull this together, this will be somewhat difficult. So this is the reason why I wouldn't overestimate this tandem. Just 2-3 sentences on the role of Germany in the Baltic Sea. I mean, my perception is that Germany does not have any genuine Baltic Sea region country identity, and that the main driver for what Germany is doing is this willingness to take on more responsibility internationally, somehow in general, and not necessarily in its, well, the term near abroad is a bad term, but in its vicinity. And the strong role of Germany in the Baltic Sea region these days is, I mean, of course, for a concern there, but also I think that this fits very well with German identity and the German vision of what engaging more means. And also for purely constitutional reasons, it's a lot easier to send soldiers to Lithuania on an exercise than sending them on operations on other continents. So in that sense, I think Germany has great potential in this context, but the debate is not there yet. And what the debate will be once there is a government remains to be seen.
Well, I'll confine myself to the role of Germany in the Baltic Sea. I kind of agree with Barbara in the sense that my understanding of Germany and German identity, and I'm not an expert on Germany in any way, is that this Baltic Sea aspect of German identity has been subdued to a large degree, but it's still increasing. I had the opportunity to talk before a conference of senior German army leadership earlier this year, and it was obvious to me that the interest for them right now was the Baltic Sea region and the task of deterring Russia from doing bad things there. So there has been changes. On the other hand, though, we have the economic problems that the German defense forces have had the last decade or so, with a lot of cuts and so on. And it strikes me as strange that so many German politicians don't like the idea of spending 2% of GDP on defense. Although the German economy is huge, there are certain needs to fill in the German defense forces. And if you take this in a kind of sequential way, taking a number of years to receive these or to reach these 2%, I think that would be a very good idea, and that would be fairly welcome as well among all the other Western Baltic Sea region countries.
I think that Germany certainly has the potential. I agree with this, with both Mike and Barbara. I think Germany is doing much better. I think it's a great news that Germany is one of the framework nations within the EFP framework. Clearly, we are seeing a move in German strategic culture with the Munich consensus: more power, more responsibility. My German friends are telling me that this is something of a fragile moment for this consensus, given the elections and sort of inward-looking moment. We'll have to see what comes out from the coalition negotiations. But that's the good things. The gap, though, between the potential and the reality is, I think, very large and absolutely needed. I mean, this is really the gap between deterrence working and not working, unless we have to look again to Americans. And here again is, I mean, Mike mentioned this, is the condition in which Bundeswehr is in many ways, especially when it comes to heavier forces. I mean, the number of tanks, I mean, they have to rebuild this. And again, the last piece is, again, readiness. In the NATO context, there is one additional piece that I've learned more recently from some colleagues in Brussels. Their perception of, it's their words, not mine, of Germany being almost obstructionist when it comes to filling the graduated response plans. So that would, not only that's something that has to happen. So potential is there. There is, if there was a major shift in the Polish government policy, you could see actually a greater Polish-German military cooperation, which was planned for a while. It's probably not going to happen immediately now, but I think there is a need for Poland and for others to pull Germany closer, frankly, to make it more of a Baltic Sea state, given that they really are on the Baltic, if you look at the map.
Thank you. I will take a couple of more questions. We have, let me see here, lots of hands in the air. I'll try to take it in the order as I saw them. And I'll take 3 at a time. We're starting with Bo Hugemark in the front, and then Niklas Granholm, the gentleman in the back.
I'm Bo Hugemark, Swedish Atlantic Council. A question about the nuclear weapons. Please look back some 3 decades or a little. Imagine 1990s if Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, would the Allied have dared to concentrate those forces and liberate Kuwait? What I mean with this is that if the tripwire forces are overwhelmed and Russia creates a fait accompli, they would have the possibility to deter liberation of the conquered territory by threatening with nuclear deterrence. So my question is there any possibility to prevent Russia's creating fait accomplis in the Baltic states?
Thank you. We're moving on to next question.
Thank you. Niklas Granholm, the Swedish Defence Research Agency. I wonder if the panelists could expand somewhat on the discussion on how to reinforce and aid the Baltic states. You were very much focused on the land side, troops, army, but you can also see what role would air power and naval power play in such a context. And also, I agree with Bo Hugemark, the nuclear dimension, if you place that layer on top of it, what do you get? Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from our organizer, Dr. Lars Hensel, all the way in the back.
Well, actually, I just wanted to make a brief comment also on what was said and ask about Germany here, and draw on a comment by Michael, drawing Germany in. The problem is that everybody wants to draw Germany in. You know, we are in a very specific situation that we have to take care about many things that are going on in Germany. Be it the Balkans or even the Catalonians, if they have a problem, they call in Berlin. So that's one of the problems we have at the moment. Yes, there is a growing understanding that we have to take more responsibility also in the north, but also in defense and foreign policy in general. But we also have to build up a constituency for that. And I think we are in a process to do that, but we are not there yet. So these are two elements. I mean, everybody is pulling, and the other thing is also that you know, we have to build up a constituency for that. And these two comments I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, and I promised a question over here before I let the panel answer, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Sten Kjærgaard. I'm from the Danish Institute of International Studies. We had Baltic security in scope in this panel, and we were having emphasis in the morning keynotes about the Nordic cooperation. And none of you mentioned any role for the Nordic cooperation when addressing the Baltic security issue. Does that mean that there is no role to play for an enhanced Nordic cooperation to deal with security? We just heard that Germany might not be the obvious support as we see it. So please expand if you can.
So we have 3 questions and a comment for the panel to react to. Please try to keep your remarks brief, so we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions towards the end. So take them in the order as you please.
Who do you want to start?
Maybe Mike, you look willing to comment?
Well, let me be very brief. On the event of a Russian fait accompli, Colonel Hugemark was asking about that. Well, the best thing is, of course, to deter it in the first place. And the issue then becomes the deterring game. If there is a fait accompli on the ground, then you can only deter nuclear strikes of that kind with major nuclear strikes on Russia. And that is a very nasty thing. It's going to be an escalation process that is very dramatic in many ways. But that is what you have to threaten with, so to speak. So, of course, the whole effort that the West is doing right now is to prevent that to happen from happening in the first place. Which is why I think deterrence as such, including nuclear deterrence, must take a much greater role in this debate as a whole. On Niklas's comment on reinforcement of air power and sea power, a very good question, because we tend to focus on the land forces, as they are the most problematic, the slowest, the most people involved, and so on. What we see, obviously, from the American side in particular, is that the first kind of action would be most likely an air power thing, because it takes days, or at least many hours, to get only from Poland up to Estonia, for example. And you need to do that not in a contested air situation where you have enemy aircraft kind of trying to kill you. So air power is very important, and sea power as well, although sea power is also slower, of course, than air power, but it must be there too. And that goes into what I was trying to say on the A2AD issue. You need to find ways to protect yourself from long-range missiles, or to do something about them before they get to you, so to speak. On Nordic cooperation, finally, well, I think, as I tried to say as well, that the Nordic cooperation is a very good thing for the future as well, but it's much better to do that in an institutional framework, within NATO, that is. If the entire Nordic-Baltic collection of countries would be all NATO members, we would have a much easier way of dealing with Nordic cooperation.
I'm happy to jump in. On fait accompli in the Baltics, I mean, fully agree with your scenario and problem. The answer to this one is getting as close to deterrence by denial rather than by deterrence by punishment as possible. That is, of course, tricky because we can't just put 7 brigades in the 3 Baltic states, even if some might want to. I think that could be slightly provocative to the Russians. I would agree with this one. So the answer is again of well, I think there are a couple answers. I mean, we are looking at putting slightly larger forces slightly closer. That's one thing. Readiness, and ability to, because basically ability to reinforce them. So the fait accompli scenario is just too expensive, right? I mean, they are not irrational actor; they are opportunistic actor. And we haven't talked about one issue that, when does this happen? It happens when, especially U.S. And others are busy elsewhere. And I think there is a deep connection, and Minister Karbel mentioned the Asia theater. Right? I mean, we are in the midst of potential, there is a potential for some kind of conflict in North Korea, South Korea space. The US would be distracted. They openly talk about inability to be in 2 places at the same time. So I think, getting much closer to deterrence by denial with greater forces closer and an ability to move in quickly. On air and naval power, the big problem, fully agree with Mike, is A2AD. Not only that, this is not a problem only in the Baltic, of course, but also in the Greenland, UK, Iceland gap, the Guyuk gap. I know that the Americans are worried about it because it's clear that there is submarine activities that are that could be disturbing to reinforcements. So point number 1 in such a scenario would be what do you deal with, what do you do with Kaliningrad? Basically, how do you turn off the A2AD from Kaliningrad? So one has to have these capabilities. On question of Germany, just very quickly, I fully agree with your point on everyone calling Germany. But of course, it's Germany's security that is at stake here, and I think I also fully agree with your comment about the need for a constituency, and I think that's it's a long march, but it has to be done by German political leaders convincing German society why it's needed.
Thank you. I will take 2 final questions from the audience. We have the gentleman in front of the camera. Please be given a microphone.
Thank you. Robin Allers from the Norwegian. Institute for Defense Studies. Thanks for your great comments and analysis here. I want to follow up on the question of Germany and the 2% spending issue, and a question on formats. On Germany and 2%, I think it's important to know, and you are exactly right, that has been a paradigm shift since 2014. There's a great willingness, especially in the German armed forces, to do more, to spend more, to think more about readiness and deterrence that you haven't seen in the years before. And there's much more money in the system than ever before. There has been a turn, but there's also a debate about the symbolic number of 2%, and there's disagreement among politicians. But I think this political debate shouldn't distract from the fact that there's actually has been a paradigm shift, and there's no political force close to power that is questioning this consensus in any way. So these are, in a way, two interlinked but different things. Then I was intrigued by the many formats that you discussed, and they are there: bilateral relations, NATO, PESCO, and I would be interested to hear, especially perhaps from the Swedish and from the Polish perspective, on how your governments value these different formats. I mean, how much do you see them putting into these PESCO projects? I can't see Sweden or Poland as a lead nation for any of those. Of course, this doesn't mean they're not involved and interested in participating. But I mean, how much do your governments value this particular form of defense integration as opposed to other formats? Thanks.
Thank you, and I think we have to use the rest of the time to let the panel answer this question and react to your remark. We'll start with Mike. You look ready, and then we'll go to Barbara.
Well, as I said before, I'm not representing the Swedish government here, so I can't talk for them. But let me put it this way: I think the bilateral format has been appreciated very much by the current Swedish government because it has big domestic political problems about taking up a NATO membership debate right now. This is the key thing for them. And the issue of having bilateral relations is not bad in its own right. I mean, the problem is that you can't use it, in my mind at least, as an ersatz kind of NATO membership thing. It doesn't hold water in that regard. But it's certainly made right now or presented right now as the best possible way for the current time. But that might change after a new government takes power next year, for example.
Barbara, do you want to react to the question or give any final comments in this panel?
Sort of a mixture of all that. I mean, coming back to Germany and perhaps also Nordic cooperation and securing Baltic Sea security, I think what is still important to keep in mind that securing Baltic Sea security has a purely military dimension, of course, but it doesn't stop there. And there's also the political dimension. And I think that in particular is where Germany has a role to play. I mean, the sanctions regime, to just give that example, without the political capital of Berlin, I think it will be very hard to keep that up. I mean, it will be harder to keep it up anyway, but Berlin has a leading role to play, and also, well, sort of the sanctioned constituents also have to argue their case in the rest of Europe that is increasingly skeptical of these sanctions. I mean, to just give one example that exceeds the question of air power, sea power, and what have you, which is also important, but there's this other dimension to take into account. So there.
Thank you. And finally, Michał.
Yeah, absolutely. Very quickly on Nordic, I didn't have a chance. I forgot about that. Sorry. I'm so shy. I will project. Very quickly on Nordic, I haven't had a chance to answer this one. This is not a big debate in Poland, but there could be more about Poland having a little bit more cooperation with the Northern group. I don't know about joining immediately, but something on the horizon. On Germany, we talked a lot, so maybe I'll just go directly to PESCO. So Polish government joined PESCO, notify about joining PESCO on the Friday when the deadline was on the Friday morning, and the deadline was noon that Friday. So just to, there was really a last minute sort of outcome of a long debate, but a last minute. And I'm mentioning this because this shows the conflicted thoughts and feelings toward PESCO. For Poland, and it's not even ideological, even though there is some aspect of this, but if we take this aside, for Poland, it's going to be always about capabilities. Poland wants to do defense if it actually produces stuff that you can use for your defense. And there is a real question to what extent PESCO will be able to deliver on this one. There is hope, there is certainly the mobility is one of the good projects, but there is basically, I think Poland in the end joined because PESCO became this very German and very open project rather than French hardcore strategic autonomy project that became, I would say, the European Intervention Initiative. So basically, in the end, it's politically, yes, militarily, it's nowhere close. In the end, it's all about NATO, cooperation with the US, and politically, more broadly, EU, absolutely, but not when it comes to real capabilities. Thanks.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank all the members of the panels. Don't forget your little box of chocolate that is here. It comes in handy for Christmas. And also thank you, the audience, for such relevant questions and for listening to us. And now it's time for lunch.
Thank you.